Now I will tell you a story about Yeti, Bigfoot, about how they found out about him and how they looked for him. They followed his tracks and hunted for him.
More recently, the Himalayas were extremely inaccessible and closed to foreigners. These were several poor mountainous countries, the main resource of which were inaccessible snow peaks. And almost until the 19th century, Europeans were very little interested in them. However, already in the 19th century, when British officials get to India, they are among the first to hear about a mysterious creature living high in the mountains. For example, the British resident at the Nepalese court, Hodgson, reported that his servants, while traveling, were afraid of a hairy, tailless humanoid creature. Rare scientists who got into the Himalayas in those years and began to interview the local population on the subject of who do you have here in the mountains. They often received the answer: yaks, wolves, bears, yetis, mountain goats, and so on. Wait, the scientists said, who are yetis? And they received a description of a humanoid creature with red hair and a pointed head. But in those years, scientists decided that the dark villagers mistook bears or monkeys for Yeti. Although it is difficult to imagine that a person who has lived in the mountains all his life and knows perfectly well what a bear or a monkey that lives next to them looks like, cannot distinguish these animals from another creature. One of the researchers of the world of Sheckley writes that Yetis are present in Nepalese and Tibetan religious images, which depict hierarchies of living beings. Here, says Sheckley, bears, great apes and small Asian monkeys are depicted separately from the Yeti, which suggests that there is no confusion between these forms, at least in the minds of artists. They are different creatures. In the 19th century, at least one European reported that he personally saw a captured animal that looked like a Yeti. That's what he told Mira Sheckley. Many years ago in India, my wife's late mother told me that her mother had seen what could have been one of these creatures. It was in the trash at the foot of the Himalayas. This half-man was straight walking, but was clearly more animal than human, as his entire body was covered with fur. They said he was captured in the snow and held in chains. And to be honest, this is so proof. The beliefs of the villagers or rumors like my mother's mother saw something at a fair once do not cause enough confidence. Therefore, Yeti in the 19th century was something from the category of mermaids, dragons and other evil spirits, in which the dark villagers believed. But in the 20th century, everything changed. Much has changed in the Himalayas in the 20th century. First of all, there have been serious political changes that have given foreigners freer access there. Secondly, it was a surge in the popularity of mountaineering. He was born in the Alps and has already had enough of them. He wished for higher peaks. And there is plenty of this good in the Himalayas, and streams of climbers and mountain expeditions from different parts of the globe have flowed there. They, unlike the English officials, climbed much higher into the mountains, and there, in the villages, the concentration of legends about the Yeti became much higher. But we must understand that for most of the indigenous peoples of the Himalayas, the Yeti was not something mythologized. It was not a deity or a mountain spirit. Yeti was absolutely real, like a mountain goat or a bear. Therefore, the villagers were very offended when scientists did not believe in its existence. The Greek researcher Tembotsi was one of the first to see this creature with his own eyes. That was in 1925. He camped near the Semo Pass on the northern slope of Kanchenjunga. Suddenly, the porters called him out of the tent and pointed to a dark dot in the distance. They claimed it was a Yeti. He writes, "I took out my binoculars and looked in the direction indicated. For the first few seconds, blinded by the glare of the snow, I couldn't see anything. Then, at a distance of 200 yards below, I recognized the object that the porters were pointing at. Undoubtedly, the dark figure kept perfectly straight, occasionally bending down to dig up the roots of dwarf rhododendrons. She looked dark against the snowy background, and no clothes were visible on her. After about a minute, this creature went behind a dense thicket and disappeared. Later, when I came to this place, I examined his footprints. They were very similar in shape to humans, but only 6 or 7 inches long. The fingerprints and instep marks were clear, and the heel marks were indistinct. And I don't attach any importance to the charming tales that the natives tell, no matter how plausible they seem to me. I can only say with certainty that the silhouette of the mysterious creature corresponded to the outlines of a human figure. And in 1937th year, an English expedition led by the famous mountaineer Sir John Hunt meets unusual traces. The expedition took place in eastern Nepal, and Khan moved along the northern side of the same Semo Pass. At an altitude of 19,000 feet, he meets 2 chains of footprints that were so similar to human ones that at one point, he even wondered if someone had been to the top before him. However, as it was later established, no one could be in this area at that time. Again, in 1937, another English mountaineer, Frank Smythe, takes a photo of a chain of footprints. However, experts have found that most likely there are traces of a bear in the photo. But these stories, which were told not by dark villagers, but by respectable English ones, generate interest in the Yeti themselves. But the search is interrupted by the war. Almost until the 50s, few people were interested in the Yeti. The only attempt was made in the 48th, when 2 Norwegians, climbers from a Swiss expedition, tracked down to Yeti, whom they decided to capture with the help of arcana. As a result, the animals went on the attack, knocked down and crushed one of the Norwegians, and then disappeared, as other members of the expedition hurried to help the victim. Then, the eyewitnesses believed that they had met with 2 large apes. And finally, 1951st year comes, and a frenzied surge of interest in the topic of the Yeti. Because, scouting the approaches to Everest, on the Hum Pass, the famous English explorer and climber Eric Shipton sees unusual tracks and takes quite high-quality photos. One of the clearest photographs will later receive the unofficial name Shipton's Trail. These were the first clear pictures of the tracks. This photo was published by Pop Science magazine in the December issue of 1952nd year. It was then, at the beginning of the 50s, that the topic of eating really went to the people. In general, the 50s were characterized by a surge of love for everything paranormal. There were fewer and fewer white spots on the map. Unicorns, people with dog heads, dragons used to be painted on them. And people started to miss the whole paranormal. The first UFO reports are beginning to appear. In 1953, the BBC organizes an expedition to Loch Ness Lake to look for the Loch Ness Monster. So the search for the Yeti was not something out of the ordinary. This photo of Shipton, of course, got to Sir Edmund Hillary, who was just going on his expedition to Mount Everest. Being a skeptic, he suggested that these tracks were the superimposition of the tracks of famous animals, deformed due to the melting of snow. But, obviously, he doubted his version himself, and the story of the Yeti really hooked him. He'll come back to her a little later. In the meantime, the newspaperman took up the case. At that time, newspapers and magazines were the kings of the media, and had incredible finances and opportunities. An employee of the Daily Mail newspaper, English journalist Ralph Izard, who worked in India in the late 40s, became interested in stories about an unknown hairy humanoid creature that terrifies the inhabitants of the Himalayas. Ralph Izard was a very energetic and active person. Back in England, he organizes an incredible advertising campaign in which he promises to find a Bigfoot. Since the topic was well known, he quickly finds a large number of sponsors and a lot of money. He managed to raise $1,350,000. At that time, it was just a fabulous sum, which even the scientific community was not capable of. Thanks to this money, he manages to assemble a very well-equipped and high-quality expedition. He is recruiting really good specialists. The expedition included Charles Stoner, famous zoologist; Gerald Russell, a naturalist who gained fame due to the fact that he was the first to catch a giant panda; Another member of the expedition was a hayback Hudku, a specialist in animal skin dressing, Bisway Basuas, an employee of the Animal Welfare Administration in India, as well as experienced climbers, guides, porters and Sherpas. And they go to the Himalayas to look for the Yeti. But in fairness, I must say that their goal was not to catch the Yeti. They weren't going to catch him and bring him to America or Europe. Their maximum task, if successful, was to keep the Yeti in captivity for some time in its habitat, study it, and then release it. At first, the possibility of using sedatives was considered, but then, having no data on the safe dose of such drugs, this was abandoned. This largest expedition to find the Yeti took place in 1954th year, and took place on the southern slopes of the Himalayas from the top of Makalu to the Nangapala Pass. That's where they were looking for this creature. Their searches and observations took place mainly at altitudes from 300 to 6,500 meters above sea level. And the main routes took place in the vicinity of the Barun Glacier. And this is what Ralph Izard writes about the preparation of this expedition in his book In the Footsteps of Bigfoot. Naturally, we studied everything that was known about Bigfoot at that time. The result was as follows. These data are scarce and quite contradictory. To a large extent, they are based on the general impressions that most travelers in the Himalayas have about the existence of some unknown animal in remote and inaccessible shelters. The only real fact was the photos of strange footprints taken by Eric Shipton and some other climbers on the snowy slopes of the Himalayas. But the question of who they belong to caused great controversy. Some scientists have suggested that these tracks belong to the Himalayan monkey langur, while other experts have just as categorically argued that the so-called Bigfoot is none other than a large red bear. The expedition arrived in the country of the Sherpas, thus having at its disposal before starting the search only very vague stories and unconvincing rumors about the object of their search. Therefore, at the initial stage, Izard set himself two main tasks. The first is to collect as much information as possible from local residents, and the second is to start direct observations and research. And very soon, the researchers realized that the Yeti is absolutely real for the locals. They considered him an animal living high in the mountains, on a par with wolves or wild goats. And when researchers expressed doubts about his existence, the Sherpas looked at them with regret. After a few days, an amazing fact became clear. Regardless of who, when, and where saw the Yeti, all descriptions gave exactly the same picture. Yeti is a small, stocky humanoid creature, about the height of a 14-year-old child, covered with stiff, bristle-like hair, usually reddish-brown in color, sometimes black. He has quite a human figure. He walks on two legs, but when frightened, or climbing a steep rocky slope, he gets on all fours. He has a flat, monkey-like face, a somewhat pointed head. There is no tail. The Yeti emits a characteristic cry, loud piercing sounds, reminiscent of the cries of seagulls. And during the expedition, in addition to a huge number of tracks of bears, wolves, and other famous animals, chains of tracks were also found, somewhat resembling human ones. However, the Sherpas did not always point to them as traces of the Yeti. They were quite objective, and often said that it was, for example, the trail of a bear, which, due to the melting of snow, takes the form of a human. This is how Ralph Izard recalls it in his book. We spent about 15 weeks on the routes, climbing rocks and glaciers, rolling down and climbing up again. During this time, I have surveyed at least 15,000 square kilometers of a mountainous area, located at altitudes from 4 to 6,000 meters. We haven't combed it. And who knows, maybe 100 Yetis were hiding in this area and watching us from behind the rocks. By all accounts, they are very rare. And, as the locals categorically claim, they lead a wandering lifestyle. They do not have a specific lair or den near which they could be tracked. Meeting with them could happen anywhere and only by chance. But to our great satisfaction, we, in any case, were convinced of the complete absence of any theoretical objections to the possibility of the existence of an animal unknown to science in the Himalayas. The climate there does not interfere with the life of many large mammals. Food, vegetable and animal, is available in abundance. In particular, there are a lot of squeakers there. These are small rodents resembling guinea pigs, which Tibetans consider the main food of the Yeti. Alpine mountain vegetation can also provide food, not only for mountain goats and sheep. But besides searching and observing, the expedition had, so to speak, a plan B. They were going to study the mummified body parts that were stored in some Buddhist monasteries, and, according to the assurances of the monks, belonged to the Yeti. And perhaps the most famous such artifacts are the so-called Yeti scalps, which were stored in one of the Tibetan monasteries. These scalps, as shown by subsequent studies of hair produced in England, were very ancient, about 800 years or even more. The question of which animal these scalps belonged to was not resolved at the time of writing Izard's book. The examination of those years, obviously, was not the most accurate, and decided that the hair belongs to an unknown species. But the opinion of English scientists of those years was already inclined to the fact that the scalps shown by the expedition participant were not real, but only skillful fakes made of skin from the shoulder or back of an animal, which, when processed, was given the shape of the scalp of a pointed head. And in fact, the achievements of the expedition of Ralph Izard were very small. Just a few photos of melted footprints in the snow and hair samples from the so-called Yeti scalp. This is the conclusion Izard comes to in his book, analyzing various theories of the origin of the legend of the Yeti. Theory 1. The Yeti is a langur monkey. Langurs are purely forest dwellers. In summer, they rise to heights of up to 3,600 meters. This is the border of the forest on the threshold of the Sherpa country. They are well known to all the Sherpas and other locals who constantly meet them, just as we met their tracks when we went down to the valleys for trade. Himalayan langurs are large grayish-brown monkeys with a tail, a very characteristic dark complexion, bordered with silver fur. They stay in herds and never go far from the forest. On the ground, they move easily, on four legs, holding their long tail high. Even at a distance of several hundred paces, they cannot be confused with another animal. During the survey, all Sherpas, without exception, strongly believe that it is simply impossible to confuse langur and Yeti. The second theory. Yeti is a red bear. In this matter, it is necessary to understand the following. As mentioned earlier, the Sherpas and Tibetans consider the red bear to be one of the varieties of the Yeti, but completely different from the little Yeti or wild man. For its inhabitants, the red bear is as familiar an animal as a mountain goat or a wolf, because many of them regularly visit Tibet on trade business, and quite often see bears on their way through the northern ridges of the Great Himalayas. They categorically claim that red bears never enter their country. In support of this, they very logically point to the circumstances that bears pose a real threat to livestock in Tibet. They bully yaks and sheep. Meanwhile, no one considers the little Yeti dangerous for their herds. If the little Yeti man and the red bear were one and the same, then we would have to admit that Sherpas can recognize a red bear in Tibet, but they can't do it in their homeland. In addition, all Tibetans quite clearly distinguish between these two varieties of animals. In general, everything suggests that in this remote, vast and unexplored mountainous country, there is some kind of animal that is still unknown to science. Maybe it will turn out to be some kind of anthropoid apes, or just monkeys, or maybe some new kind of bears. The fact that we did not manage to see Yeti does not exclude the possibility of his existence in this area. And despite the fact that the expedition was not a scientific success, Izard's book In the Footsteps of Bigfoot was wildly popular. It was a bestseller. And this book has given Yeti even more popularity, although the Himalayas were all over the news anyway. After all, on the 29th of May, 1953 year, Sir Edmund Hillary, along with his partner Sherpa Tenzing Norgay, were the first to ascend the highest point of the planet Everest. And for a while, the attention of the whole world was focused on the mountain peaks. And, of course, the topic of the Yeti was also not bypassed. Under the search for this creature, they were ready to allocate any money and any resources. So, for example, in 1957 year, the millionaire oilman Tom Slick organized a large-scale expedition with his own savings, which lasted for many years, but just like the previous one, did not bring much results. And here we turn, perhaps, to the most famous researcher who ever went in search of a Yeti. Despite the fact that the topic was extremely popular and real scientists were engaged in it, the majority of the scientific community still treated it as some kind of bliss and obscurantism. Until Sir Edmund Hillary himself, the first man on Everest, took up the matter. I'm afraid no one has the heart to argue with the fact that this is really a pioneer and a major researcher. Although Edmund Hillary was skeptical and often said that all these photos of footprints were just melted human footprints, but, obviously, the confidence of the Sherpas and a huge number of eyewitnesses gave rise to doubts in him. In addition, in 1952, he himself stumbles upon a piece of skin covered with truly black fur. It was during an ascent in the Choyu area in the Himalayas. His Sherpa porters tell him that this hair belongs to a Yeti. And his partner and also the first person on Everest, Tenzing Norgay, claimed that his father and brother had personally seen the Yeti. Whether Hillary believed in Yeti or not, it's hard to say. Rather, he admitted its existence. But undoubtedly this topic was a very important advertising move for him. And as I have already said, any budgets were allocated for such popular topics in those days. And it was possible to organize any expedition. And climbers almost always depended on sponsors. And in 1960, Sir Edmund Hillary organizes his next expedition to the Himalayas. Her goals were, firstly, to study the effect of height on the human body, and secondly, to search for the Yeti. It is obvious that without this second hype theme, the expedition would have received much less funding. Mountaineer and explorer Ed Douglas, who personally knew Hillary, writes in his book The Hero of the Himalayas, "The Yeti was a useful marketing tool. I doubt Hillary really believed in him, except when he was talking to sponsors." However, not the Fingers, obviously, had completely different ideas about the reality of the Yeti, and even registered this creature in their official documents. There is an official memorandum of the government of Nepal, dated 1947 year, which sets out the etiquette of hunting Yeti. It was reissued by the American Embassy in Kathmandu in 1959 year, specifically for the Hillary expedition. Usually for climbing expeditions in Nepal concerning the Yeti. It stipulates that government permission is required to search for Yeti, and that Yeti cannot be killed except in self-defense. But, one way or another, Hillary's expedition went to the Ralvaling Valley on the morning of September 10, 1960. The valley was chosen because Sherpas reported sightings of Yeti in the area, as well as because of its proximity to the harem of Kalu, the fifth highest peak in the world, which, obviously, interested Hillary much more than the search for Yeti. There he planned research on climatization and the effect of altitude on the human body. This expedition included researchers Peter Mulgrew and Wally Romance, who accompanied Hillary on his 55th-58th expedition to Antarctica. American space physiologist Dr. Tom Nevison, glycerologist Barry Bishop, Marlon Parkins, director of the Lincoln Park Zoo, Dr. Laris Vaughan, as well as Desmond Doig, mountaineer, journalist and photographer, who would later write several wonderful books about the mountains, including about this expedition. The research methods of Hillary's expedition were practically no different from previous attempts. When they got to the Himalayas, they began by collecting folklore and all possible information that the locals had about the Yeti. This is what Desmond Doig writes in his book on the Cold Peaks. The task of the first stage of our work was to prove or disprove the existence of the Yeti. To do this, we studied all the legends and stories available to us about encounters with this creature, the remains, as well as footprints in the snow. We wanted to photograph the Yeti with the help of telephoto lenses or automatic cameras, which were activated by a trap or other system. We were hoping to record Bigfoot's voice, a high-pitched whistling sound that Sherpas are said to have heard. The leader of the expedition, Edmund Hillary, has always been against catching Yeti. Here's what he said about it in one of his interviews. "This creature will not survive in captivity. I would release it as soon as possible, after careful study. It is unlikely that he can like it in our civilized world." The survey of local residents brought a huge amount of information. Almost every Sherpa has personally seen and met with the Yeti. Thanks to these stories, scientists are able to distinguish 3 different types of these creatures. Here's what Desmond Doig writes about it. Jute is a bear-like creature, 6 to 8 feet tall, covered with either light, red, black, or gray hair. Despite the fact that the Jute are mostly vegetarians, they are known to use their long claws when hunting cattle. Another creature is a mit, bipedal, the size of a small person, covered with black or red hair, with a long head. Another creature is called Thelma. It is considered a beast with a sad face the size of a dwarf. It lives in dense forests below 10,000 feet. Most of the legends that were collected in the villages ended with a Yeti attack on a person. And in general, in folklore, this creature appears quite dangerous and aggressive. Therefore, Hillary's expedition was quite well armed. Here's what Doig writes. None of us really wanted to shoot, but we carried ordinary rifles in self-defense. Because in most stories the Yeti is described as an extremely dangerous creature. In our arsenal, there were pistols capable of shooting tranquilizer darts, as well as rifles, shotguns, and gas pistols. And here is a comment by Sir Edmund Hillary, the leader of the expedition, about such a large number of weapons in the expedition. We had guns and syringes with sleeping pills in order to immobilize him. But for this it was necessary to determine the permissible dose of the drug per kilogram of animal weight. This could only be done by specialists, and I did not have Yeti specialists in the expedition. So we took weapons with us only in case of self-defense. Moreover, the Nepalese government, in turn, prohibits the killing of Yetis. This expedition surveyed a fairly large area of terrain. Its participants walked thousands of kilometers through valleys, mountain passes, and peaks. They collected a lot of stories and testimonies about meetings with Yeti. They also took several photos of the chains of footprints that the locals attributed to this creature. Here's what Desmond Doig will write about these traces later. They, located at a distance of 20 to 30 inches from each other, seem to have been left by bare human feet, of the 11th or even 15th size, a wide rise, a fallen arch of the foot, and a big toe protruding inward. However, when these traces were shown to Hillary, he was quite skeptical about them. He said that it could be the superimposition of traces of already known animal species that were deformed in the process of melting snow. The plaster casts that they tried to take from these traces, again, were of rather poor quality, and were no good. Analyzing the information on all 3 types of Yeti, scientists come to the conclusion that these creatures are often mistaken for other animals. For example, the Jute is a large shaggy brown animal that feeds on meat, and is found at altitudes of about 4,500 meters. It was most likely a large red bear. Another type of Yeti is the myth. According to local descriptions, it is a wild, ape-like creature of red or black color, having a conical shape of the head, and feet turned back. It occurs at altitudes of about 4,870 meters. It eats people and is still questionable. And the last kind is this Helma. It's almost certainly a monkey, most likely a gibbon, because they live in dense forests below the snow line. It turns out that the only candidate for the role of the Bigfoot of the Himalayas, against whom there were no sufficiently strong objections, is the myth, whose scalps are kept in Buddhist monasteries. Observations and searches did not lead to anything, and did not give any results. And photographs of footprints on the melted snow could not be proof. In addition, the casts of these footprints were of extremely poor quality. And then Edmund Hillary decided to go with the trumps. Many local residents, especially in local Buddhist monasteries, kept relics. Body parts, mummified remains, scalps allegedly belonging to Yeti. It was for these artifacts that Edmund Hillary began hunting. But there is one problem here. The locals realized very quickly that they could earn money here, and each of them had a similar relic in his chest, in quotes of course. Numerous Yeti skins are shown to the expedition group, mostly of blue-black with a white stripe on the shoulders. According to general opinion, belonged to a Tibetan bear. The sacred relic, which was called the Yeti hand, kept in one of the monasteries in Punk Bach, on closer inspection, turned out to be a set of human and monkey bones connected by wire, and as many as 3 Yeti scalps were found. These artifacts turned out to be the most convincing and weighty evidence because scientists failed to refute their authenticity on the spot. Or maybe they just didn't want it to bring home a louder sensation. And after much persuasion and argument, Sir Edmund Hillary receives a unique permission to take one scalp abroad for just 1 month, accompanied by a Buddhist monk, in order to study them in Paris, Chicago, and London. Back in England, Sir Edmund Hillary gave an interview. "I never believed in Bigfoot, but I admit the possibility that I was wrong. The scalp is difficult to explain. This is a convincing example. The locals consider him the scalp of a Yeti and treat him with great respect." However, after a short research, scientists were disappointed. This alleged sculpete was made from the skin of Sarov. This is a very cute furry animal, something between a goat and a deer. However, the relic was really ancient. Her age exceeded 300 years. When the last hope of the expedition to prove the existence of the Yeti collapsed, Hillary said in his interview, "This was the collapse of the main evidence in support of the existence of the Yeti. The members of my expedition could not see it as anything more than a fascinating fairy tale. During the 10 months we spent in Nepal, we did not see a single bear. We met very few animals at all. The largest of them is a wolf. If even bears and snow leopards tried not to catch our eyes, then what can we say about a reasonable being?" As already mentioned, our most convincing arguments prove nothing. Someone has yet to explain the frequent cries of the Yeti, and continue to study the tracks in the snow that could belong to a primate or a big bear. Someone will finally have to establish who the Sherpas, Bhutanis, and residents of northern India actually see, mistaking their visions for Yetis. It was one of the largest expeditions to search for Yeti and Bigfoot in general, which, unfortunately, ended in failure. Later, of course, there were more expeditions, there were more attempts to find this creature, and not only in the Himalayas. But this is a completely different story.